Wondering whether those newspaper horoscopes have anything to them? Or perhaps you just want to learn a bit of astrology yourself? Well, stay tuned, because in this video I'm going to go into the basics of astrology, why it's used, what it's used for, whether it works or not, and how you can do it for yourself. Now, you don't have to believe that astrology works, and personally I want to suggest that you perhaps look at it from a different perspective than how most people suggest it works. Basically, a lot of people have this idea of astrology being this science where the planets are directly influencing our world in some fashion or another. Now, what most people forget is that when astrology was created, we didn't actually have clocks. So timekeeping for the various human cycles and other cycles was done using the stars and their positions. Now, what people found over time was that many of the cycles that the different planets and different stars made could be correlated to different things that happened on Earth. For example, I mentioned before that the cycle of the moon roughly corresponds in time to the woman's menstrual cycle. So you can see how this would have been useful to people. They wanted to know when certain weather conditions would come about, or when it was going to be a good time to hunt, and so on. They would try and find a cycle that was related to this, and then they would find something up in the heavens that had a similar cycle, so they could tell when X amounts of this cycle had passed. So astrology is almost like, really at its basics, just a timekeeping method for a bunch of cycles that we know exist on this Earth. Now, whether or not astrology and the correspondence between those cycles is actually accurate is another matter. I think in most cases it actually has a reasonable degree of accuracy if someone understands how to read it. But what it doesn't do is have accuracy in the cases of what most people are using astrology for these days. In other words, newspaper horoscopes using just your sun sign. Don't get me wrong, those are good fun or whatever, but you're not going to find out much about yourself looking in a newspaper astrology column. Nor are you going to find out much about the world either. There's a lot more to someone's natal chart than their sun sign. So, that's the brief introduction over. Let's get on to the actual basics. So in astrology, you have the different planets and the different positions that you look at. And I'll go through these. So, first you have the ascendant, which is a bit like the kind of mask you wear to the world. It's first impressions people get of you. It's your first impressions when reacting to new situations. And I also see it as a door and an avenue through which you can grow in the face of your responsibilities. That's the ascendant. Next up you have the midheaven. And this is related to your social reputation in the world, perhaps where you're going to go, what career you'll have, this kind of thing. This was also used a lot more in ancient times. In ancient times, if someone was going to war, they'd look at the position of Mars, because Mars is associated with war, and they'd also look at the midheaven, which was the kind of central focus of the day. That was something they saw as a central focus of what was going on. So next up you have the sun, and this is the one you see in newspaper astrology. When someone says, what star sign are you? They mean, what sun sign are you? And your sun sign is almost like a bit like your outer self, but it's also your will and what drives you, the direction you're going in, and your natural strength. After that you have the moon. And I mentioned this is corresponded to the woman's menstrual cycle, and it's interesting because the moon is also correlated to the feminine side of the mind as well. In other words, the subconscious, the inner self, and your emotions. After that we have Mars, which is naturally the warring planet, just as was the god Mars in Roman mythology, and it is associated with drive, energy, your power, your strength, your motivation, that kind of thing. If you're working out, if you're having a run, that's kind of Mars energy at work. That's what it means. And it's also associated with battles and conflicts and that kind of thing. So when there's certain Mars aspects, people would believe it's more likely for there to be a war, or for you to be more likely to be victorious in a war, and that kind of thing. Next up you have Mercury. Mercury is essentially the messenger, and it's associated with communication, intelligence, language, technology, and teaching in particular. And so me doing this video, that will be a Mercury aspect. Then you have Jupiter, which is associated with abundance, growth, increase in it of any kind. You know, if you're getting lots and lots of wealth just coming to you, that's Jupiter. The downside of Jupiter is it can also be excess. You know, if you're doing too much of something, there's a Jupiterian aspect to that. Apologies, by the way, if you can hear my dogs barking. I'm not sure if you can hear that in the background. Venus is associated with love, pleasure, beauty, passion, the thing you love doing in life, and the people you love in life. Then you have Saturn, which is essentially the astrological planet that most people are afraid of in some way or another, because Saturn represents your kind of boundaries and limitations and your responsibilities and stuff. And Saturn can be quite a hard teacher. In other words, if you don't do the things that are your responsibilities as far as your Saturn placement is concerned, then you're going to have difficulties usually. Whereas if you overcome them, then you tend to reach success. At least that's the kind of general theory behind it. Next up, your basics when actually looking at a chart. You have two kinds of interactions. You have positive interactions, which include trines and sextiles, and you have negative interactions, which are oppositions and squares. Now you actually have a bit more variation in this, but these are the main things you want to look at. If you actually go to somewhere like astro.com or somewhere like astro.com and you actually look at your chart, you'll be able to see the different interactions between the planets there. You can actually print out a chart and so on. I'd recommend signing up to astro.com as well, because you can actually do your full natal chart there and so on, and you can get it in a nice little format as a PDF file, and that's what I use for doing my astrology and that. So yeah, I would recommend going there, getting yourself a copy of your natal chart and start having a look at it. Remember what I've said about each of the signs. So when you look at your sun sign, you might see where your kind of natural strength is, what you're good at. When you look at your moon, you might see where you are emotionally, what kind of person you are in terms of your emotions, like if you're a big dreamer, if you're someone who's an artist, that kind of thing, that comes from there. Where your Mars is will affect the kind of energy levels you have, how active you are, how proactive you are about taking things on in your life. You know, your Mars is going to show you a lot of where you take opportunities and how often you take them. Your Mercury is going to show you a bit about the ways you communicate, whether you're an actual teacher or speaker or not, that kind of thing. Jupiter is going to show you the things that you do a lot of, that you do in excess, that you do a ton of. And it's also going to show you things about your financials and that kind of thing, how successful you are with money. Venus is going to show you the things that you really love doing in life and the things that you love in other people. Saturn's going to show you the kind of responsibilities that you need to face up to, and so on. It's been a little quick recap on the main planets there. So if you get your natal chart and you start looking at that, you'll see some things about yourself in there, and then you can decide from that whether you think there's actually any truth to it, if it's actually worth exploring. Once you've done that, if you actually think it's worth exploring, or if you just want to, for curiosity's sake, learn a bit more, then what I'd recommend doing is starting to look at the daily astrological positions. Now what I'd recommend doing is just going into Google and typing in, you know, the relevant signs. What you want to do is get up a little list of all the signs and their characteristics in that. This is what I did as a beginner. And then look at the daily positions. You can look on astro.com or on astrotheme.com or somewhere like that, and look at the positions of the planets currently, and you'll see, for example, Mars is in Leo, or Mercury is in Sagittarius, or something like that. And from that you can actually read up what this particular sign means, what does Sagittarius mean, what is Leo associated with, and all of that. And then you can actually remember the characteristics of that planet. And so, for example, say you've got Mercury in Leo. Well, Mercury is associated with communication, intelligence, technology, teaching, that kind of thing. So you look at Leo and you see that Leo is courage, leadership, that kind of thing, the lion essentially, and so you might see that this is a time for leading in teaching, that kind of thing, or leading in communication, for being more communicative. And basically it's a kind of intuitive process. Once you look at what the different signs, what their characteristics are, and then you think what actual planet, what purpose is going through there. The way I like to think of the planets is a bit like the actual thing that's being affected. The planet is like the actual thing that's being affected. So, if you're dealing with Venus, that's love and all things related to love, beauty, pleasure, and that being affected. Whereas the sign is almost how it's being affected. So, Venus going into Gemini is a different effect on love, relationships, beauty, and that than Venus going into Leo. So, aside from that, once you start comparing and learning a bit intuitively, because I really recommend learning this way. Yes, there are some good books out there and stuff, but I personally learned about astrology this way. And the great thing about this is when you learn to do it this way, then say, you take a long break from astrology and you forget how to do it, you can just go back onto one of these sites, make sure you've got a list of all the characteristics of the different signs handy so you don't forget anything, remember what the planets mean, and then put 2 and 2 together and make conclusions like that. Next thing you want to do is actually compare your natal chart to the daily positions. Now, most astrology sites will allow you to do this in some shape or form. They'll allow you to overlay your natal chart on the current daily positions, and you'll be able to see aspects between those. So you'll see, for example, one of your things in your natal chart is opposing something in the current positions. Now that means there's a negative interaction between the two, which will usually kind of reduce the effects of both in some way or cause some kind of conflict. Or you'll find that, for example, maybe your Mars in your natal chart is actually currently in a sextile, which is one of the positive interactions, with something in the current daily position. So you might find that because of that, you're getting more energy, you're having more drive, and so on. Now, I'm not going to go into too much more detail in this video because I want to keep this brief and at least somewhat understandable even to a complete beginner. But what I'll suggest is just read the basics of each sign of each planet a few times over and keep looking at the daily positions, keep looking at your natal chart, studying it in depth and the interactions between the two, because it's really the interactions between the two where you want to start learning about what's going on in your life. So say you want to know a bit more about your current relationship situation, well, look what aspects Venus in your natal chart has to anything going on at the minute. If your Venus in your natal chart isn't aspecting anything at the minute, then firstly, where is Venus at the minute, in today's positions, and where is Venus in your natal chart, and study that. Whereas if, for example, it is aspecting something, look at whether those aspects are positive or negative. That should give you an initial clue if relationship things are going well or bad for you. And look at where they're focused. If it's a negative aspect, but it's just in, say, something related to communication, then perhaps that just means that you need to work on your communication better in your relationships and so on. Now, I want to again add the disclaimer that I'm not saying that you have to believe any of this, but I suggest exploring it for the sake of curiosity, and that it's an interesting thing to learn. And I think you might be surprised at how accurate some of this stuff is when you actually take the whole chart into consideration and take all of the planets and all of the signs into consideration. Sun sign astrology, where you're just taking someone's sun sign and trying to make predictions on that, is horribly inaccurate, and I think the only reason people think it's accurate for them is, it's just cognitive bias, essentially. Whereas if you actually look at all of the planets and where they are now as opposed to where they are in your natal chart and how those are interacting, your natal chart and the current positions, then you can actually tell with some reasonable level of accuracy certain things that are going on. Now, it's something that requires a good reader, a good eye for what's going on. If you have someone who's reading it badly, then they're not going to be quite so accurate. If you have someone who's reading it well, then they can be very, very accurate, like scarily accurate. So I don't suggest going out there and forking over your money to an astrologer for advice or whatever. If that's what you want to do, then fair enough. I personally just suggest learning it yourself, seeing what you think about it, give it a try, and if you like it, then continue learning more and see what you can learn from that and see what you can gain from that. Anyway, I hope this video has been informative. I know I haven't gone into that much detail. I just wanted to give people a quick rundown. You know, if you know nothing about astrology, you come here, get a quick rundown and go off and learn some for yourself. If people are interested in this, then I'll do some more advanced videos and I'll talk more in detail about each of the planets and so on. Oh, one last thing that I'll throw in before I finish the video is I'll just let you know the correlation with the days of the week. Monday equals Moon Day, as the name suggests. Tuesday equals Mars Day. Wednesday, or Mercredi as it's called in French, is Mercury Day. Thursday, or Thursday, is essentially Jupiter's Day, as Jupiter is correspondent to Thor in Norse mythology. And Friday is Venus Day. Saturday is, as you guessed it, Saturn's Day. And Sunday, no surprise here, is the day of the sun. So that's been all for this video. I hope you enjoyed. Please do give it a subscribe, a thumbs up, leave a comment below, and if you liked it and thought it could help someone else out, then give it a share to one of your friends.